Next to dental enamel and dentine, root cementum is also an important hard substance structure of the teeth. Without the root cementum, the tooth-retaining fibers cannot attach the teeth to the bone. And this chapter therefore deals with the development and the structure of the root cementum of the teeth. Without the root cementum, the tooth-retaining fibers cannot attach the teeth to the alveolar bone. A root cementum is a thin layer on the root of the tooth, and this is where the retaining fibers radiate into the root of the tooth. And together with the root cementum, they form a really strong bond with the root of the tooth. And the topics, or learning objectives if you like, in this video are the origin and the formation of root cementum and its structural composition. We will also discuss the regenerative capacity of the cementum as it is formed for life. And in this context, we will also clear up a misconception. In anthropology and in forensic medicine, teeth are often used for age determination because it is thought that age can be counted on the cementum lines on the root. Towards the end of this lecture, I will explain to you that is not possible. You can read about cementum in many good textbooks, and of course all the content I discuss in this lecture can be found in my textbook Oral Structure and Biology. That is why I always include the page numbers at the top left corner next to the book's front cover image. Cementum covers the root of the tooth, and this is why it is referred to more specifically as root cementum. And this root cementum, shown here in red in this diagram, is a mineralized connective tissue, but it is not innervated and does not contain any blood vessels. However, the retaining fibers of the desmodont have grown into the root cementum, and their desmodontal fibers, which run inside the cementum, are called Sharpey's fibers. In this way, because the retaining fibers are firmly connected to the cementum, the tooth is anchored in its bony socket. This means that the root cementum is also part of the periodontal tissue. There are at least 4 different types of root cementum in humans. I have described even more types in the book, but you will have to look at them there, otherwise it will become too complicated here. There are differences in terms of structure, fiber and cell content, but also in terms of localization, rate of formation and biochemical composition, and degree of mineralization. Let us go through the 4 different types of cementum. The acellular, afibrillar cementum does not contain any cementocytes and also no collagenous fibers. It is the first layer of cementum that is formed during tooth development. In this respect, it primarily even also covers part of the cervical enamel. That sounds a little bit unusual, but it is true. The cervical parts of the enamel crown may actually also be covered with cementum. We find this in animals, for example, always in horses and other herbivores. Horses often have somewhat brownish teeth, but this is not due to lack of care. No, there are layers of cementum on the enamel. This is also the case in humans, but only very slightly and much less extensively. This type of cementum also occurs as cementum tongues or islands of cementum on the enamel surface. We will take a closer look at this later in this lecture. So the acellular, afibrillar cementum just discussed does not contain any cells and also no fibers, and it is deposited prior to eruption of the tooth. And now this, the acellular extrinsic fiber cementum, also contains no cells, but it does contain fibers. These are the Sharpe fibers that radiate from the periodontal space into the layer of cementum. But why does it not contain any cells? Of course, cementum always is produced by cells, in this case by the cementoblasts. But with this type of cementum, the cementoblasts are usually not trapped by the deposition of their own matrix, which they themselves have produced, but they are pushed to the surface. And this way, this type of cementum is predominantly acellular. And this type of cementum covers more than half, which is 60 to 90% of the root of the tooth, and it is deposited directly on the freshly formed dentine matrix. And now comes the cellular intrinsic fiber cementum. This type of cementum does indeed contain cells, which are cementocytes and also own fibers, but no extrinsic fibers radiating into it. The intrinsic fibers are groups of fibrils that run parallel to the root surface, and the cementocytes organize this arrangement by creating compartments running parallel to the root surface with their cytoplasmic processes. We find this type of cementum in the bifurcation region as the first thin cementum layer directly on the fresh dentine surface. Here it is already formed prior to eruption of the tooth. And we also find this cellular intrinsic fiber cementum also after eruption at the apex of the tooth, and also in lacunae, which are filled with cementum for repair. Well, maybe it is not always quite that schematic, but we want to create just a bit of a system and sort of an overview somehow. And a little bit of everything is the cellular mixed fiber cementum. Since root formation is a continuous process that extends over several years, the phase of initial cementum deposition on the still growing root also lasts for years. This also results in the different distribution of the various types of cementum on the tooth root. At the beginning, the acellular extrinsic fiber cementum is formed in the cervical region of the tooth, as we have already mentioned. And later, when root formation is more advanced, more of the cellular intrinsic fiber cementum is formed apically, or, if it is a multi-rooted tooth, in the area of the bifurcation or trifurcation between the roots. This type of cementum can also spread coronally and deposited over the acellular extrinsic fiber cementum. And conversely, acellular extrinsic fiber cementum can also be deposited over the cellular intrinsic fiber cementum. In this way, the cellular mixed fiber cementum is formed. From this point of view, cellular mixed fiber cementum is not actually an independent type of cementum, but rather a mixed product consisting of alternate layers of cellular or acellular intrinsic fiber cementum and acellular extrinsic fiber cementum. But it regularly occurs layered in this way in certain regions of the tooth root, and that is probably why the labeling with its own name is justified. In the diagram here, I have, of course, shown this layer extremely enlarged. At this point, we can ask ourselves how cementum is mineralized at all. It starts from individual globules that melt together as they become larger, and later calcification continues along the smooth surface. The mineral component is also hydroxyapatite, as it is in dentine and in enamel. Cementum is slightly more mineralized than bone, and the order would be like this. Enamel is the most mineralized, 95% by weight. Then dentine, which is 70% by weight, and then there comes cementum, which is 60% by weight, and then bone has about 45% by weight of mineralization. And the opposite is true for the organic matrix. Bone has the most, cementum also has quite a lot, and dentine even less, but still enough to be elastic, and enamel is now really brittle, with only very little organic matrix, so only 1% by weight. And how quickly does the cementum layer grow on the root surface? Quite slowly. Towards the end of tooth eruption, when the tooth comes into occlusal contact, the cementum layer is about only 15 micrometers thick, and from then on the cementum thickness increases for life, but only 0.01 to 0.1 micrometers per day, which is quite slow as a growth rate. By the time you are 70 years of age, the cementum thickness can be between 100 and 500 micrometers, and apically the cementum is thicker than cervically of the tooth. Now we have seen that there are different types of cementum, now with and without cells in it, and with and without fibers, and with its own fibers or with extrinsic fibers in it, and there are even layers of cementum mixed on top of each other. And now there's another morphological aspect that we need to discuss. What is the situation at the Cementoom-Enamel junction in the cervical region of the tooth? Let us take a look at this diagram. On the left at A, I have just sketched a tooth, and you can see a white square at the transition from the crown of the root. The transition from the crown to the root. We will now talk about this area in detail, and we can see it in the enlarged square in the middle, labeled with B. And at the top in gray, this enamel with the letter E, then cementum is shown in red with the letter C, and in between it is dentine in white, labeled D. And the three small letters X, Y, and Z can be seen at the top of the picture with vertical lines. And I have used these to draw these typical arrangements. At X, the cement layers is directly adjacent to the enamel layer, and this situation would be the most beautiful, so to say. In Y, we have an overlap of the cementum layer over the enamel, and I have also drawn some cementum islands in red on the top of the enamel, which is light gray. And as you see, something like this also occurs in humans, although we see it much more prominently in horses and in other herbivores. I've talked about that. And at Z, the vertical line runs in such a way that the zone of uncovered dentine peeks through, marked with white, between the enamel in gray and the cementum in red. And this also seems to be normal, and everyone knows this. Perhaps when the gums do retract a little bit, then the dentine is really somewhat exposed here, and if you are going jogging in the cold and breathe in the cold air with your mouth open, then I see that it can get really cold at the neck of the tooth. At least that's the case as you get older and your gums do really retract even more. In this case, the cementum layer close to the crown is missing or has been lost, leaving dentine exposed. And here the cementum layer is also very thin, only 50 to 100 micrometers. And if there's nothing left, then it hurts, as we have the pain conduction in the dentine. When removing calculus, while therapeutic scaling on the cementum surface is undertaken, there is always a risk that the protective cementum will also be removed. So you have to be very careful when you do this. So now we've seen the different types of cementum and the distribution of the cementum at the Cementoom-Enamel junction. I'm always interested in this, otherwise I can't remember it. How is cementum layer formed? Here I have drawn a tooth in which the last third of the root is not yet fully formed. The crown, enamel, and dentine are clearly visible at the lower edge of the picture. And apically, Hertwig's epithelial sheath can be seen in orange, which is a duplication of the inner and outer enamel epithelium. Enamel formation is already complete, but this epithelial sheath continues to migrate apically and determines the shape of the tooth root. And in the chapter on tooth development, we have already talked about how the dentine layers attach from the inside. Hertwig's epithelial sheath difference then largely dissolved, and the bare dentine surface becomes freely accessible for the cementoblast to deposit cementum on top of it. I have drawn the cementum layer in brown in this picture, And it is also interesting to know where the cementoblasts come from. They arise from the pre-cementoblasts, and these originate from the dental follicle, which is just indicated as a thin line in the picture above. The fibroblasts also originate from the dental follicle. They form the retaining fibers, which I have drawn in green on the cementum layer and labeled as Sharpey's fibers. That is why they are called when they pull into, inside, or within the cementum. They are firmly incorporated when the cementum is deposited in layers, and they pull all the way across the periodontal space to the bone and grow into it, so the tooth is firmly connected to the bone. And all this happens even when the tooth is not quite ready, even before the tooth will erupt. We can see here that the formation of the root cementum is closely linked to the formation of the tooth root. I have illustrated this in more detail here in this diagram. At A, again the overview, so we are at the neck of the tooth, where the root has just started to form. And on the right, at B, you can now see all the details. For cementum formation, it is important that Hertwig's epithelial sheath dissolves to such an extent, I would love to know how this is controlled, to such an extent that the dentine surface of the freshly formed root comes into contact with the cells of the dental follicle. And this should then trigger the differentiation of the connective tissue cells from the dental follicle into cementoblasts. As soon as freshly formed root dentine surfaces are freed from their covering by Hertwig's epithelial sheath, the deposition of cementum on these dentine surfaces just begins. As far as I know, it is not yet known how the differentiation of the dental follicle cells into cementoblasts is triggered. The diagram shows that pre-cementoblasts are always formed first, which then become cementoblasts. And the same applies to the fibroblasts that form the retaining fibers, which I have drawn as thick red fibers and labeled as cemento-alveolar fibers. And deposition of cementum and, of course, the formation of new retaining fibers, both of which does last a lifetime. And in these pictures, we can see the layered deposition of cementum. In the diagram on the left at A, the thin layer of cementum on the root is again shown in red. And in the middle at B, this is a histological section in which the dentine is labeled D, cementum is labeled C, and PDL is the periodontal ligament. And these are the fibers which attach to the bone at the tooth surface. And now take a closer look. The cementum shows a clear layering. So here you can see that cementum is deposited in layers continuously. And in the diagram on the far right, I have exaggerated the cementum layers, and the Sharpey fibers are also drawn in black into the cementum layers. And they do change their direction in each layer. This can also be seen in histological sections with higher magnifications. And this is proof that the teeth are constantly moving. So they are constantly rocking back and forth in their bony socket, and the fibers are always stretched in different but corresponding directions. And at the same time, cementum is layered, and you can say that the respective fiber direction is fixed within the cementum layer. This is proof that the teeth are constantly moving, rocking back and forth. Well, just like the ships here in Embarcadero in San Francisco. And imagine a dock worker who always throws a ladle of cement at the ships and thus fixes the ropes with which the ships are tied to the jetty in the respective direction on the ship's hull, just as the ships are currently leaning back and forth. So that way, I can imagine it quite well. If you would take a scan of your dental arches every week, let's say for 2 or 3 years, you would be able to see the rocking of your teeth like in a time-lapse movie. There would be about 150 individual images, enough for a 5-second movie. Do that. I would be interested to see it. Now let us take a closer look at the layered structure of the cementum as we can see it under the light microscope. So on the left, this is a horizontal section and the cementum is actually much too thick here, thicker than normal. This is a patient showing a hypercementosis, which is an excessively thick buildup of cementum. But that way you can see the growth lines better in this picture. In the middle, this is normal cementum, and you can see the individual layers, the lines of growth, very clearly when magnified higher. And on the far right, you can also see this in the confocal laser scanning microscope. Christopher Dean from London gave me this image. And take a close look and tell me whether you can really follow these lines continuously. We will come back to this question at the end of this lecture. But it is also quite peculiar that when we look at cementum even higher magnified in the transmission electron microscope image, there we can no longer see the lines that identify the layered structure. So we can recognize that the dentine is on the left, then a layer of acellular extrinsic fibrocemento, and further left still acellular intrinsic fibrocemento, and at the right edge of the image we have already reached the periodontal ligament. But there should now be a lot of growth lines visible here, but you cannot see them under the transmission electron microscopical image. These are quite strange optical phenomena. Before we come back to these lines in the cementum and the layering, let us take a look at the cementocytes first. With this slide, we want to take a closer look at the cementocytes. To provide an overview, a section through a tooth is shown on the left-hand side of the image arrangement, and here we can see the cervical region. D is dentine, E is of course enamel, which is only very thin, is cut towards the neck of the tooth up there, and at the bottom, golden brown, labeled with C, this is the cementum. And incidentally, a small piece of dentine is exposed between the enamel and the cementum at the neck of the tooth, so the enamel and the cementum are not in direct contact here. This cementum layer is enlarged in the middle image in B, and there you can also see the layering in different colors, intense yellow, golden, brown. It looks really beautiful. And yes, and in the picture on the far right at C, you can now see the cementocytes. These cementocytes, as we have already said, are formed from the cementoblasts which produce the cementum. And then they are walled into the cementum by their own product and can no longer get out. This is also the case with the osteocytes in bone. And long cytoplasmic extensions can be seen on the cementocytes, with which the cells probably are in contact with each other. And in this way they are also in contact with the cementum surface. And that way they are really similar to osteocytes. We have already said that cementum is deposited for life at a rate of 0.01 to 0.1 micrometers per day, which is quite little and slow. And if you are 70 years of age, the cementum thickness can be between 100 and 500 micrometers depending on where you look at the root. As we know, the cementum is thicker apically and then at the neck of the tooth. And cementum can also be broken down. This happens usually in closely circumscribed small areas as shown here in the picture with R for resorption. In general, however, the cementum surface is less susceptible to resorption than the alveolar bone, for example. The relative insensitivity of cementum to resorption may be due to the fact that it is covered by a dense layer of non-mineralized collagen fibers, which may prevent access by the cementoclasts. Nevertheless, you can always see a lot of small, narrowly defined resorption defects, as in this picture. Perhaps they are the result of microtraumas in which the delicate collagen matrix is broken down by inflammatory enzymes. The cementum surface is then exposed, and this creates access for resorption. And in these resorption lacunae, multinucleated giant cells can be seen, which are referred to as cementoclasts or odonoclasts, or also dentoclasts. However, they cannot be distinguished morphologically from osteoclasts. Resorption of cementum can also occur during physiological tooth movement, and due to the mesial drift of the teeth, more resorption spots can be found on the mesial root surfaces, marked R in the circle in the left-hand image. And even at the root tips. It is an unwanted complication of orthodontically induced tooth movement if resorption of the root tips is found during the X-ray check. We try to avoid this by applying only low forces to the tooth movement, and it does not happen too often, luckily. But if a patient is affected, it is of course very bad for them, and you cannot predict whether it will happen. There are always also cementoblasts in these resorption lacunae, and these cells ensure the immediate deposition of acellular intrinsic fibrocementium, now we know what that is, with which the defect is quickly repaired. This happens quite often, and the cementum surface looks more like a repeatedly patched road surface of a German country road, as shown here on the right. The frost damage is only ever repaired in places after the winter, and only a new road is as smooth as the one on the left. Now, towards the end of this lecture on root cementum, we come to the question of whether a person's age can be determined from their teeth on the basis of the cementum deposits that occur throughout life. In anthropology and in forensic medicine, the cementum lines were actually regarded as growth lines, like the growth rings of trees, and therefore they were actually used to determine age. But is this really possible? We were interested in this after we had studied the micromorphology of cementum so intensively. Dr. Herbert Renz is an expert in micromorphology, and we really examined a lot of teeth and took a closer look at the cementum, and we wanted to count them more precisely. To do this, we did section the roots of many teeth into many horizontal slices and examined them under the light microscope. You cannot see these lines very well, or not at all, under an electron microscope, but you can see these many lines under a light microscope. So here, as a reminder, this is what it looks like. On the left is a section. This is a tooth with a thicker layer of cementum, a little bit unusual. This is a hypercementosis. We talked about that. Cementum is usually so thin that you can hardly see anything. And on the right, you can see all these lines. And we counted the number of these lines in the many individual slices through the root. Separately for each region, I mean how many lines are mesial, how many are distal and buccal and lingual for each of the many slices on the same tooth. And here is the result, taken from our publication. We had counted 8 teeth as described, and the result was quite strange. Let us look at the column for tooth number 1. For this very and the same tooth, we determined 15 lines as the lowest value, and 54 lines as the mean value of all counts, and 80 as the expected value, and 84 as the maximum value. Why is that? Well, that is because we counted different numbers of lines mesially, distally, buccally, and lingually in the same ground section. And we could not at all follow these lines in a circle, and if there are more lines mesially than distally, then they cannot be cementum annulations, but rather different numbers of patches at each point, like on the German country road. And therefore, you cannot trace the lines in a circle. And in addition, there were also different numbers in each layer, which makes sense to me because the cementum deposition cervically and apically is not uniform either. So to conclude this, you cannot determine the age from the cementum lines. They are not any kind of cementum rings. Instead, there are multiple interrupted lines in the sections, and they indicate many local patches of different sizes on the same tooth, and they have nothing to do with the age. Their formation is independent from age. It is not possible to determine the age in this way for morphological reasons. And no matter how sophisticated the statistics in the counts are, they do not help, as we have found this kind of ambition in some other studies. But it just doesn't work. So now we come to the take-home message. We have seen that cementum is formed by the cementoblast and they come from the dental follicle. We have discussed the 4 different types of cementum. There are few more, but you can read about them in the book. And we have seen how sharp-rays fibers are embedded in the different layers of cementum in different directions. And then we took a closer look at the cementocytes and saw that cementum is constantly resorbed and repaired, so there are more and more of these patch-like depositions. And that is why these are not annual rings, and that is why we cannot determine their age on the basis of the cementum lines. And with that, I thank you for your attention on this lecture on root cementum.